So recently, I was giving a speech to promote the book festival, and I was chided by one of my board members that I'd given him the shortest bio he had ever read, but apparently he did not read Dane's. Dane Bahr was born in Minnesota. He lives in Washington State with his wife and sons. Yeah. Longtime journalist Gwen Florio moved to crime fiction in 2013 with her first novel, Montana. It won the Pinkley Prize for debut crime fiction and a High Plains Book Award, and launched a series termed Gutsy by the New York Times. Best Practices, the third in her Nora Best series, was released September 6th by Severin House, and The Least Among Us, featuring public defender Julie Geary, launches December 6th. I just started The Least Among Us. It is fun. Alrighty, folks, just a little bit of house cleaning. After this, we have Catherine Raven over the next room. She will be reading from 6 to 6:45, giving you just enough time to make it over to the ZAC to see Jamie Ford. So hope to see you all there. I'll be heading there in about an hour to get ready. I'm really glad you're all here, and I'm going to hand it over to Gwen. Oh, Dane. Yeah, we decided alphabetical order. Isn't that right?
Gwen decided alphabetical order.
Can you all hear me? Do I need to speak with the
For the recording.
for the recording?
Oh, yeah. I can get you a mic stand if
Yeah.
you like.
Do you got one? That'd
I'll
be great.
right back.
Probably drop the microphone. Until that point, this book, The Houseboat, is about this strange man lunatic guy that's living on this dilapidated houseboat on the banks, the slough of the Mississippi River, and his personality goes from the kind of the haunting, haunts the people of the town, and goes from kind of this threatening to violent. A young girl is found claiming her boyfriend has been murdered back in the slough. The sheriff, believing that it's kind of beyond his purview, has a detective come down from Minneapolis to help, who has demons of his own. And then the two kind of start to swirl in this maelstrom together, foils in a lot of ways. And as the book goes on, thanks, Sam. How's this thing work? Did I just jam it in there? Seems awfully. Okay. Great jamming, Dane. Is that okay? Okay. Yeah, so it starts to go from, they start to kind of just swirl and kind of either disappear together or, yeah, but I'm going to read the prologue first, and then I might read, we want to keep the readings, we were kind of talking, just keeping them shorter, but, so this is the prologue. During the late summer of the dry years in that valley of Iowa, when the rains run reliable, the elm trees and bur oaks hardened and grayed with the dust of passing trucks along the county roads. All the green of the Alamaki Valley was dulled by that dust, and a wilted look to everything appeared, and the horses and the cows, dusted in their pastures, moved like ash blowing in a small wind. The little grass near the roads was short and brittle, and the weeds rooted in the dry ground turned a dark green and pushed out along the dry earth. The leaves on the trees grew crisp and rattled on their branches, ants scuttled in thin processions, dark rivulets on the tallow land, and grasshoppers clicked on their inadequate wings and ratcheted their long legs together in the narrow fields of bluestem. Tall clouds grew in the distance each afternoon, hopeful, but dropped their reins over another country. And the tractors crossing their fields drove that dust into the air. The evenings were golden, and the settling dust gilded the sky. And the mornings were heralded with dew, but the white sun quickly burned that away. And the river would slip through the lowest stones of the bed like a whisper. The bullfrogs huddled in their drying places and cried out wildly into the hot nights. The hardened prints of the animals in the dry mud showed where the river had been, and the blanched logs of flood's past told her where it was going. When there was a saying among these people, a dry year will scare you to death, and a wet year will kill you. In the wet years, when the pale blue of the sky darkened and the big clouds, heavy with rain, came from the south and did not skirt the valley, the country changed. The air grew muggy. The dry county roads became cratered, slowly at first as the new rains came gently, and the coming rain gave a sweet smell. Mothers would come from their houses and call in their children, and men working their fields would pause, hooking their thumbs in their denim overalls, or stoving their hands into the hip pockets and face the darkening sky and sniff at the air. The first rains cleaned the thin film of dust from the trucks, and soon there was no dust at all. The county roads became gullied and sloppy with red mud, and the trucks forded that slop. The men huddled with their arms crossed in the open bays of their barns and muttered crossly once in a while as the rain pounded down. During particularly wet years, a group might gather at someone's place, and in the barn they would set up picnic tables and hold a kind of impromptu social as a talisman to the rain. The women would bring pies, and the children would chase each other through the barn. Someone might bring a fiddle or a guitar, and a few might even dance, but you could see in the hard faces of the men the word they carried like religion, and their eyes could not lie. The women would steal careful glances toward their men, sharing their worries as they served pies to the children, talismans themselves. In 2 days of hard rain, and the townspeople would watch the river turn brown as the water climbed its banks. 3 days, and the mayor would close the smaller bridges on the outskirts of town, and the townspeople would begin to sandbag the south end. 4 days of hard rain, and the river became a butcher. It would rip at the banks as it swelled and cleave the edges of cropland like knife to brisket. The rain fell, and the river would feed. There was nothing it wouldn't take, trapping pigs and cows and gnawing on timber girders until the bridges collapsed on themselves. Days of that and no ease. Dawn would come, but only because the world still turned. But the east would not pale like their prayers had asked for, a dawn rising like dusk, no sun, and no relent, and the children would not run to plain it like they first did. And as the day became dusk, the sky would darken, and night would fall quickly, and still the rain came, and the river butchering. So the nature and landscape has always been a big one for me. It's always kind of been a bit of a character. And was I going to? But I want to give you a sense of this Rigby guy. So like I said, he lives on this dilapidated houseboat. And he starts to kind of swirl out of control a little bit. And just one scene I should have dog-eared in. Of course, I brought my give you a sense of who this guy is. Was it chapter 22? Maybe that's it. Shoot, no, I can't find it. Let
I'll say
me.
ahead of time, when he says swirl out of control a little bit, understatement.
Well, that might be kind of a good one. Hunting through the forest, no. Climb the stairs, no. Sorry, everybody. County clerk, no. Oh, here we go, okay. I believe this is the one. Yeah, so this is so he lives on his houseboat with a few, his only company are a couple of mannequins their names are Susie Lee and Mary Bell. So this is kind of him starting to go a little psychotic, or more psychotic than he was. A false fall arrived at the end of August that year. A gray sky with a cold wind. The houseboat pulled in new directions, and there were new sounds to get used to. Morning had the smell of colder weather, geese honking and congregating in parking lots. Thoughts of his mother swirling like eddies. Rigby kept out of sight, walked to town only when his cupboards thinned. And even then he spoke to no one, picking through the stocked shelves of the nearest store. Yellow cheese and tins of Vienna sausages and sardines, bundling those in his arms and spilling them over the counter beside the till. The thin cashier in a white apron tallied up the goods and eyed him with suspicion. End of summer, said the man, bagging the groceries. Said Rigby. He was picking at the corner of the counter where the Formica was lifting. Don't pick that. Rigby levered up his eyes to the man. $1.40, the cashier said. Drink near the whole of August, he stumbled upon a canvas bag holding 3 bottles on the steps of a gas station. He raced away with his prize, clambering into the ditch and just into the woods, where he uncorked the first bottle and drank a quarter of it. That night he danced, swayed with Mary Bell in his arms, humming some out-of-tune number. The north wind blew. Winter came too soon. The ice hung like chandeliers in the forest, and the winds set the trees healing and crackling like fire. The weather brought a freeze to the slough, the houseboat locked in time. See him during those short days gathering sticks, piles of moss, discs of frozen shit, and hauling them cradled in his arms to burn in the stove. Mary Bell seemed to eye him with contempt, like she deserved better. And some nights he'd wake to her staring blankly at him from her tilted place in the floor, as though she was capable of judgment. Christmas came with falling snow, lighted trees in all the town windows, wreaths hung on doors, and cedar garlands snaked like vines in storefronts. Carols being played everywhere. Christmas Eve, he listened on an AM station to the Nativity broadcast. Mary and Joseph in the manger, the birth of Jesus, the teeny voices of the radio actors sounding far off through the speaker. He cooked a Christmas supper of baked beans and sardines, crouched near the stove, eating his paltry meal with his eyes closed, imagining what Bethlehem might look like. He'd not thought of his mother in quite a while, but the tinsel revelry of the season made him feel something like nostalgia. Something like nostalgia because he'd never seen her face, save the fleeting hours his clouded infant eyes gazed at her before she left him. Never heard her voice, the way it might sound when she said his name. Something like nostalgia because all he had of her was his own invention. And when the seasons warmed again, he resolved to amend that. With the advent of 1960 came the cold. Second week of the new year, colder yet, found Rigby huddled before the stove, pulled his mattress over the floor, wrapped in his blankets. In the pallid light, he looked like a stone figurine, a Gothic monk vowed to a different penance. It began to snow one morning, didn't let up for a week straight. He'd shoveled the deck with a discarded license plate he'd found on the roadside, gouging a narrow footpath into the drifts. Then his boot pack leading up the bank, where it scattered like the tracks of animals come and gone in the night. Near the 30th of January, the clouds broke. First time all month, the stars appeared, a moon like a silver dollar. He stumbled onto the deck and howled at the glimmering sky. A bright day in February, set about the woods with his shotgun, hunting up whatever might be out there. He heard the voices of two boys. He was trespassing on private land, and the sound of them sent Rigby into his belly into the snow. The boys on the road at the forest edge, a white field beyond, a few brittle corn stalks stood through the snow to tremble in the wind. And each boy carried a small caliber rifle slung across his back in the fashion of a bandolier. They looked like brothers. The bigger one carried a limp rabbit over his shoulder. Rigby laid the barrel of his gun on a felled log and trained his sight on the smaller one. He gauged the wind, led the boy at 5 feet. The boys were talking excitedly about something, but Rigby couldn't hear exactly what. With his thumb, he pushed off the safety, and his forefinger tickled the trigger. He trained the sight for the younger one's head and then whispered, bang. The boys rounded a bend in the road and fell away from view, and with the safety still off, Rigby retreated into the woods. I'll leave it at that.
See if this works. Okay. Wow. So mine starts off on a much lighter tone, although it also quickly goes dark. It's about my protagonist is a public defender named Julia Geary, and the book concerns accusations against some homeless people, and the reason it's very, very, very loosely based on a trial I covered here as a reporter in Missoula. And one thing that struck me is what easy targets folks make when they are on the margins of society. And that's kind of, if there's an overarching theme, that's what it is. So this is an excerpt from the first chapter, which printed out in teeny tiny type. So we'll see if I can read it without going blind before I'm done. Julia Geary came across all kinds of stupid in the course of her job as a public defender, but Ray Belmar pushed fuck up into a whole new dimension. The justice of the peace looked down her long nose and read the charges facing Ray: public disturbance, lewdness, indecent exposure, and then turned to him and put them into appalled plain English. You ran into the middle of the St. Patrick's Day parade stark naked? On the Monday after the parade, the courtroom reeked of stale alcohol sweating its way through overworked pores. It was packed with still hungover miscreants awaiting initial court appearances on all manner of misbehavior that had crossed a legal line. The snoozers among them, there were many, snapped to wakefulness. Julia spoke up. "With respect, Your Honor, my client wasn't naked. He wore a sock. The charge of indecent exposure doesn't apply." The judge turned her glare upon Julia. "A single-clad foot does not negate the charge, Ms. Geary, as you well know." Julia cleared her throat. "Your Honor," she waited a beat. "It wasn't on his foot." The courtroom erupted. Ray turned to face the gallery and took a bow. "A sock," he mouthed, spreading his hands to indicate extra long. "Mr. Belmar," the judge slammed her gavel. Julia cast an ostentatious glance at the courtroom clock and behind her back rubbed her fingers together, knowing that Claudette Green, the county's lead prosecutor, would see the gesture from her table across the well. As they'd walked into the courtroom, Julia had bet Claudette $10 she'd have the room in stitches 3 minutes into Ray's case. "You're on," Claudette said. "They're all still too wasted to hear anything other than it's their turn to say not guilty. Now Claudette outlined all the reasons why Ray should spend some time behind bars to contemplate the error of his ways. He jumped onto the rotary float, flaunting his sock in front of a child. Chief among Ray's misfortunes was the fact that one of the Rotarians had invited his 16-year-old granddaughter to accompany him on the float. Julie appreciated Claudette's theatrics, but they pissed her off anyway. Jail time would be bad enough, but the indecent exposure charge, if it stuck, could see Ray labeled a sex offender because of the granddaughter's age. She had an inches-thick file containing the paperwork on Ray's various brushes with the law, but even during the worst of his alcohol-fueled misbehavior, he'd never crossed that particular line. She gazed out the tall courthouse window during Claudette's wearying recital. Red and blue lights still flashed from the cop cars lining the creek bank 2 blocks away, where an early morning jogger had found a popsicle, the derisive term some cops applied to transients who succumbed to Duck Creek's frigid winters. Claudette thundered her wind-up. "Your Honor, I'd ask you to deny bail to Mr. Belmar or impose one in a high enough amount that guarantees he'll remain incarcerated till his trial. He's clearly a threat to the community." Julia rose in defense of her hapless frequent flyer. "Your Honor, if this indecent exposure charge is to remain against my client, half this room must face similar charges, given the amount of public urination on the streets that day. My own little boy commented on it." The judge didn't need to know of Calvin's utter delight at the sight. Julia had to grab his hand to stop the 5-year-old from pulling down his pants and attempting to imitate the mighty arcing stream splashing against Duck Creek storefronts as the high school band marched past, merrily tootling the rakes of mallow. Additionally, if I count correctly, some 30 people were arrested on charges of public drunkenness, a dozen for simple assault, and 5 for felony assault, including a couple of sexual assaults. Julia heaved a mournful sigh. She learned a little something about theatrics herself in the brief time she'd shared an office with Claudette. St. Patrick's Day in Duck Creek continues its ignoble tradition. Ray pasted on a somber expression just in time to hear the judge acquiesce to Julia's request to release him on his own recognizance, with the condition that he be tested daily rather than weekly for alcohol and drug use at his own expense. A bailiff led him away, and Julia turned her attention to her next client. "Son of a bitch!" An outcry in the hallway outside interrupted the proceedings. A few people rose and peered through the door's glass window. The judge rapped her gavel. "Be seated." A crash sounded, followed by a torrent of strangled profanity. "Order!" But everyone in the gallery was on their feet, jostling toward the door. The judge let her gavel fall a final time. 10-minute recess. Julia and Claudette joined the pack fleeing the room. Julia stood on tiptoe, but even raising herself up to 5 feet 2 was useless given the jostling mass before her. Claudette raised her voice. "Prosecutor coming through." Julia scuttled behind her in the space that magically appeared, stopping cold at the sight of 2 sheriff's deputies wrestling a screaming Ray Belmar to the marble floor. "I didn't do it. Whatever it is, I didn't fucking do it." Julia shouldered past Claudette. "Don't hurt him. He's my client. Ray, what's going on?" The deputies knelt over Ray, one with his knee against the side of Ray's head, mashing his face against a floor filthy from the traces of melting snow and mud. The other dug a knee into Ray's back as he forced handcuffs around his wrist. Ray bucked beneath them, then fell silent. His eyes rolled toward Julia. "I don't know," he gasped. "Get off him. I'm his lawyer, damn it. Get off him." Julia pulled her phone from her blazer pocket and aimed it toward the scene. The deputies grunted to their feet, roughly pulling Ray up with them. Julia recognized one. Unlike some cops and deputies, he'd never seemed to view public defenders' efforts as an insult to his own work. "Wayne, what the hell?" He jerked his head toward the window. "The guy they found down by the river this morning?" She followed his gaze. The cop cars were still there, along with the coroner's van, but they'd finally turned the lights off. "What about him?" "He didn't freeze. Well, maybe he did, but only because somebody beat him to a bloody pulp first." "Who?" A harder man might have laughed. Wayne's gaze was all pity. "Come on, Julia. Now's not the time to start being stupid." The other deputy started to drag Ray away. "It's not possible. Ray wouldn't hurt anyone." Wayne's face hardened. "He didn't hurt anyone. He killed him." Thank you. Oops. Yeah, we're supposed to ask each other questions now.
So, I'd like to ask you a question.
Well, okay.
Do you have, so when I mentioned that nature and
Yeah.
weather is a big thing for me, I always feel like to really get like the lighting right, so to speak, I go out there and just put your hands in your pockets and listen to the birds.
Yeah.
Watch how light it gets. Do you take that, being a reporter for all those years, like really heavy dialogue, do you, when you're writing your prose, does the dialogue get it going for you at first? Do you hear the voices and the characters talking to each other, or is it the scene in which they're
That's
kind of interacting
interesting. It may be the scene, and in this book, oddly, when you mention nature plays a huge part. And
in this
yeah,
one
this fictional city of Duck Creek, oddly enough, similar, resembles Missoula that's got a river running through it. And I used to walk to work at the Missoulian in the morning, which back then was right across the river. And so I would walk along the river. You'd see all kinds of wildlife. You see a lot of transients, too, living along the river, and including in horrendous weather. And that always struck me. In the late spring, when there's a lot of snowmelt, there's an island out there that floods. I thought about that reading your book, and they're all flooded out. You know, this happens year after year. So to me, the impetus for this book was this one court case, and it, of course, immediately morphed into its own story. But then the combination of very poor people living in a very harsh climate kind of set the mood for it. As I said, it starts off on a little, obviously, almost a slapsticky note, but gets real serious real fast. I don't know if that answers your question.
well, yeah. I get the sense that your characters they're not able to rebel against their environment, and in an odd way then thrust into the judicial system, having to, its own shitty storm weather
It
in and of
is.
itself.
And its own weird little world inside that courthouse. And again, I think I covered cops and courts maybe 5 years.
Montana, your first book came out in what, 2013?
13, yeah. And that was written before I covered this beat.
Okay.
But then, you know, when I was covering it, I'd go to the courthouse every day. And it was almost, you know, the way you see TV shows about courts or hospitals, you've got this enclosed world that is just different from everything else. So that was part of it.
So as you're reporting and writing fiction,
Yeah.
as a reporter, do you have to ethically stay out of some certain real things in your fiction that you could be held liable for?
Yeah, and I think I worried more about that when I started writing fiction and less as I went on, because what I found very quickly, and I would hear this in writing workshops, you know, it's under-fictionalized. If you try to write as fiction something that happened as fact, it doesn't work.
Yeah.
It just doesn't work. I don't know why. And so even though this may have, you know, again, just the germ of an idea with something that actually happened, it took off into its own story. And
You said if you try to write something that's fact as fiction,
yeah.
is that what you said doesn't work?
Yeah, if you just
Yeah,
do
I
straight
agree.
reporting. And I don't know, again, I don't know why that is, but it feels lifeless.
We were having this conversation the other night with Hemingway, and how Hemingway would describe at times, like I really like Hemingway, but at times excruciating detail about tying a lure onto a line, and how you have to hook the fish onto the hook, and how it'll sort of skip through the water.
Yeah.
And at times, like, oh, it's beautiful, it's nicely written, but it's like, okay, yeah, we get it. You can fish.
Yeah.
So I think, with you writing reportage and trying to make it fiction, tough.
Yeah. And I think that goes to the issue of research also. Very similar to what you say about Hemingway. I remember reading Annie Proulx's That Old Ace in the Hole and feeling like I knew how to build a windmill afterward. And I don't feel like I need to know how to build a windmill.
Yeah,
Right. Anyway, so I'm curious about your book, because the thing that struck me about it is you right away know who did it. And yet there is incredible tension throughout the book. And I'm wondering, what made you go with that structure that's kind of contrary to how a book like that might normally be written?
It's because I didn't set out to write a crime book, and it's nothing against crime genre, but it was the marketing team at Counterpoint who decided to do that, and because there's a detective in it, and there's sheriff, and crimes happen, so it is a crime book, but. All novels, they should have A, B is caused by A, C caused by B. Something should happen, because otherwise, you can turn on the television or make love, do something more exciting than read a navel-gazing kind of book. But so I before I wrote this book, I wrote maybe 10 years ago. Put it away for a while, and before that, I had never read any crime fiction. It's only after this now that I'm reading like Elmore Leonard. Yeah. And I was telling some friends about John Lang, have you read any John Lang?
I don't think so. Yeah.
John Lang is a pseudonym of Michael Crichton. And it's just a fun read, and it's punchy, and it's fast, and it's kind of like dessert. But in a way, when you're really diving into it, it's fun and it's punchy and it moves along because the writing is really, really good. Yeah. And the dialogue is really fun. And it doesn't talk like a normal person would talk. It kind of punches it up a little bit, a lot like a play does, but not so theatrically, I suppose. I don't know. I've always liked the idea of the knowing that this guy did it. And it's not a spoiler to say that right now. But when you said going to the Missoulian and you'd see all these people just living in squalor. So where we live in Washington State, Bellingham, Seattle, there's a lot. And it rains a lot there. And you see all these people, literally like the cardboard is just kind of disintegrating around them. And so they're kind of almost in a way decomposing and like that idea of, it's just kind of spooky too. So that's where, to answer your question, that's where I just let Rigby's character and the lighting of the book kind of build the tension and make it spooky. Yeah.
One of the things I enjoyed about it, here we pray for rain. I mean, when I first moved west, I first moved to Denver in January, and I did not see rain until Memorial Day. Yeah. At which point I went out and stood in it. And, our summer has been horrible in terms of just so phenomenally dry. And so I had forgotten that rain can be a force of evil. That too much of it is just as bad as not enough. And many, many years ago, I covered some really devastating floods in Kentucky. And the power of water, the weight of that water rushing through a community and how destructive it is, really stayed with me. And then your book brought all that back. It just is so immensely atmospheric.
Well, yeah, and it's one of those things where if you've been around, especially river country like you are here, like my cousin Leaf knows that it's in the northeast part of Iowa. And when the upper Iowa River or the Mississippi floods, it just completely alters the landscape.
Yeah.
And human beings, in all their, technological advances and glories, can't
Yeah.
can't restrain it, and it completely decides what it wants to do. This November, we had dramatic flooding, and it completely rerouted the Nooksack River to form almost a brand river, and it's always just very powerful.
Yeah. So do you all have any questions? Oh, Brian. We were supposed to say that.
Gwen, what's next?
I have one due in December that will be done by December. And that is, says my editor, like, with that big whip. And that is the fourth in a series featuring a woman named Nora Best who zooms around with an Airstream trailer. It's kind of a weird concept, but that's how it started. So she's living in the Pacific Northwest on a peninsula that's very vulnerable to climate change. And I'm having to learn way more than I wanted about climate change and sea level rise and tsunamis, which is really fun. But at some point, plot needs to be put in there. So I'm actually close to the end of just a horrendous first draft. But that's what's next.
Are you from the Northwest?
Nope, I'm from Delaware.
Delaware.
We don't have any of this stuff. Well, we actually, where I grew up is probably going to be underwater sooner rather than later. I grew up on a wildlife refuge on the Delaware Bay. And yeah.
Have you spent much time for, kind of getting the feel and the flora out there? Have you spent a lot of time in the
I actually
Northwest?
did a writer's residency on the Long Beach Peninsula, which is kind of where I got this idea because it was beautiful. But man, a big storm is just going to go right over it.
Yeah.
They had, those tsunami warning towers everywhere. And I thought, how about this? On the Long Beach Peninsula in Washington State. It's right across from Astoria. You take the big bridge in Astoria and then go up this skinny little, very flat peninsula.
And so isn't it the longest beach in
I think
the
so.
U.S. or something?
Yeah,
It's like,
it's just gorgeous.
That is very beautiful.
Yeah. Oh, wait, he needs to go. What's next? I'm sorry.
Oh, Stag. There's a sequel to this, Stag. Sheriff Fielding is 30 years later, and he lives out in Northwest Washington. He's about a small little horse ranch, and that's due to come out with Counterpoint in 2024 as well. And then I got Glass Houses, which is completely different vein, and then Loving Vassals. I'm trying to stay 2 books ahead of the curve just so that I have something to give Harry, my editor, and so that they don't.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
It's like writing a term paper. You make it sound like product.
It is like a term paper.
It is. It is. You know the painter Chuck Close? He would do these gigantic faces basically, and he always said that inspiration is for amateurs and professionals just get to work. And
Yeah. I think that's a perfect
to.
thing. Yeah.
just to sit around and wait for your.
Oh, I would never have any inspiration.
No,
Yeah.
sometimes it'll take a little bit of time to get going in the morning or whenever you do it, 10, 20, 30 minutes, but then all of a sudden you're like, oh, okay, and then it starts to kind of click in and shoot. Even if you get, at least for me, even if you just get a good sentence, it's like, hey, that's a victory today.
Yeah.
But
Yeah. You won't get it if you don't sit down and put your hands on that keyboard or pen to paper or whatever.
I wondered how old you were when you first started covering the court here and whether you'd done that previously in your life.
I actually, usually it's what they give to beginning reporters. And somehow I weaseled my way out of it. So I had covered huge trials. I covered both Oklahoma City bombing trials. But I had never covered little dipshit arrests, from initial appearance all the way through a trial, or usually not a trial. Usually things would get settled or charges would be dropped or whatever. Until I came to the Missoulian kind of at the end of my career. And man, I loved it. It was just, and I think because I was doing it late in my career, maybe I brought more perspective to it. But yeah, I just was completely absorbed by it. And I would just get lost in reading all those court records about cases. They're just, a good lawyer who writes a good brief. I greatly appreciated that.
A question, I've read your book, Dane, and, Rigby is a frightening character, but just listening to you read that section today, you managed to create some sympathy for him. And then what you read, Gwen, it's like, we live in Bozeman, and you know what we do to homeless people there. We put them on the bus and ship.
Yep. Thanks for that.
And so there's not much sympathy for that demographic. And I fight with that all the time, too. It's like, show some sympathy to these people who are urinating where I walk my dogs or whatever goes on. But how important is it for you both to create something likable in your characters?
Mm-hmm. For me, it's all empathy. There has to be empathy in any form of fiction, and even if it's just minute, even if it's like just a fleeting little moment of where the character goes, oh shoot, if only things were different. When I was writing Rigby's character, I was having a lot of, I was sympathetic to him, or empathetic to him. However, and I mentioned this to you, I believe, but as I kept writing him, and he would develop into this, it would almost metastasize into this monster, and I started to have less and less empathy for him, and would see him more and more as this just monster who should be snuffed out somehow. Like, why is he still existing? Why are they letting him exist? Why are they letting him do this? And small little thing, but I was thinking, like, why do they let him do this? We have where we live out in the country, we have this dirt road, and at the very end of this dirt road, this woman, I don't want to insult anybody's religious affiliations, or whatever, but she's very religious, and she's taking in this level 2 sex offender who used to be a youth pastor and molested several boys. But we know he's done this. He's lied about it. And I was speaking with my dad. He said, you guys got to do what they did in the houseboat. You charge on down there with, torches and pitchforks. And you're like, oh yeah, but you can't do that. So like even I even think, like, for the characters surrounding Rigby, even though they're despising him, like, they're hopefully within this book, like, you can see that they have some kind of empathy. I don't know.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I don't know that there has to be something likable, but maybe something relatable. For instance, if someone really goes off and does something violent, whatever he or she sees as the trigger for that violence, there has to be something in there that makes you think, yeah, maybe, before you go, oh no, let's not do that. But certainly we all understand the impulse. Years ago, I was mugged, and my dad was like, you got to get a gun. And I'm like, are you out of your mind? I'd shoot the dog. It would just be bad if I had a gun. Again, you've got to find, more than anything, you have to make characters complex. Even the minor characters, they can't just be one-dimensional. Ray, my buddy in the first chapter, I initially was going to kill him. He was going to be the victim. I like Ray so much because he's just such a jerk. But he's such a colorful, exuberant jerk that I couldn't do it. I had to kill off somebody else instead. And I like that character too, but not quite as much. So there's always that. I think if I feel a little bit of sadness when I'm killing someone off or hurting them, I've done it right. Every so often, I get to, in a book, do away with someone I really despise, and that's very satisfying. But again, there's got to be a couple. They've got to be layered in some way. And frequently, I don't know about you, that comes about, it sounds like with you, as you're writing the book, the character evolves. And so I'm probably 3/4 of the way through a draft, and I know I'm going to go back when I rewrite it and invest these people early with some of the traits I've discovered as I'm writing them.
Um, yeah, I agree.
Yeah. I have a question for Dane. Because women are asked this all the time, women writers with small children at home, how are you doing it?
He has small kids, yeah. Yeah.
I just neglect the hell out of them. Give them some kibble, bowl of water. Daddy's going to write, boys. No, again, it's just discipline and sacrifice in a lot of ways for things that I used to like to do that I don't do as much. I have a knockout all-star wife who allows me to do stuff like this, who will take the boys in the mornings. I'm going to go to the shed and write. I mean, of course, she has a boiling point where she'll send Tor out onto the deck, usually, because we live out on this acreage, usually half naked, Daddy! Or he'll howl at me or something because they're feral, my children. But I think it's just discipline. And also, last night with Courtney, we were speaking about this a little bit, like, the act of writing itself is not always when you're always writing, even if you're not physically pen to paper, hammer to platinum roll. Like, if you can mull the story over in your head and kind of just keep things going and at a simmer, the plot points will work themselves out, or you'll come up with a really good line or a really good twist or something. And then it's really easy just to, and usually, I have a fairly good memory that I can, if I have like a sentence or like a paragraph, I'll just recite it to myself, and then when I get time, then I can write it down. But sometimes like the kids will be playing together, they'll be outside, and if I can have a half an hour to hammer away on the typewriter in the kitchen, then that's when I do it. But it used to be really nice. Like I would, 5:30 in the morning, I'd go out to the shed and I'd write for, 3 hours or 3.5 hours and get, usually my cutoff was if I can get 5 good pages. I took the Larry McMurtry, just some arbitrary 5 number. If I can get 5 pages, good pages written in a session, then I feel pretty accomplished. And then I can usually put it away and then be half there for my kids the rest of the day at least.
When my kids were little, I had this room, or there was like a little alcove in my house that had glass doors on it, and that was my writing room. And I would say, I'm going to write, leave me alone, And they would stand there with their little noses pressed to the glass. Mm-hmm. And I'd be like, not a word. And they would just like give me these like puppy dog looks. But I think, like you said, it's you got to do it. You got to be selfish. You got to carve that time out, no matter when you can get it, and people will get pissy about it. People were always inviting me. We live in this freaking paradise, and it's like, oh, come cross country skiing, come snowshoeing, come float the river, come do all the wonderful things you get to do when you live here. And it's like, I can do those fun things, or I can get a book done, and I can't do both. And there's a fair amount of whining involved some days with that. My husband, Scott, has been phenomenally supportive, especially when I had the day job and was doing what you did. I would get up at 5:30, and I'd be at a coffee shop at 6 across from the Missoulian, and I'd write until 9, and then I'd stagger over with a big cup of coffee in my hand and switch my brain around and be a journalist. It's really nice not to have to do that anymore. Mm-hmm. And it's really nice when the kids are grown. Mm-hmm. It's just great.
Are you writing full time?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Just novelist.
Yeah.
Nice.
Yeah, it is nice. I mean, I had early on when I quit my job, I had some freelance journalism assignments, and boy, they pay well. But I just thought I really have waited so many years to just do fiction that I said goodbye to those little paychecks. And I'm really glad I did.
That is the other thing too. It's like a long con, isn't it?
It is totally,
You're
yeah.
you're grifting yourself for. I mean, this book took 17 years when I earnestly started writing, thanks to Gwen. She's my old professor, and now a very, very good friend of mine. She was the impetus to get me writing, and I was 19. So shoot, actually, I guess that's 20 years. Yeah, that's 20 years. So 20 years before earnestly started writing to getting a book published. 20 years. I mean, that's
about what it was for me.
Nutty stuff, you know.
Yeah.
If
But, you know, I mean, there's this great essay by Ann Patchett that talks about, you know, no one looks at a first-year med student and says, hey, how about you do brain surgery tomorrow?
Yeah.
You know, but writers, they're like, well, where's your bestseller?
Right.
It's like, man, it takes a damn long time to learn how to write well. And, you know, I just feel like with every book, I'm still learning and learning and learning. You know, I thought by now it'd be easy.
Oh, I know. If
It
you
is
can't,
not
you can't,
easy.
it's almost you have to put the coals to yourself even more,
Yeah,
so that you're not just gonna churn out some
yeah. If only.
bullshit.
But anyway, we're almost out of time, but
Yeah,
we can
anybody
probably do
else?
another question.
As your characters descend into their Hannibal Lecter state, does it change you and your personality?
You can start that one if you want.
As your characters descend into their Hannibal Lecter stage, does it change you or your personality at home? I can't speak to that, he's grinning at me, in terms of my characters changing, but when I get near the end of a book and that deadline is looming, I am not a nice person. You know, I am pretty frantic and up in my room and I'm barking at the dog and I'm like, I have to get this done. So I become more Hannibal-like, I think. I don't know about the characters.
With this houseboat, it didn't. I've always been a very irreverent person, I think, for the most part, and usually telling jokes. And I'm not a dark person, but so it was almost kind of, I think, like comedy and horror operate in the same fulcrum, and it's all about like the punchline, essentially, the build up and the punchline. And so it's kind of like a big joke to me. Stag, now the second one, however, when I go out to the shed, so my mother-in-law passed almost going on 2 years now. My wife stayed in Crested Butte, Colorado, where they lived. And with our firstborn, I came back, or I'm sorry, with the secondborn, I came back with Tor, our firstborn. And it was a dark, rainy January and into February. And I was, single parenting Tor and then dealing with the grief, and then Madeline was, distraught. And I would, when I'd go to write, usually after Tor would go to bed in this situation, because he can't just go out in the morning. After I put him to bed, I'd start to write, and it was the character where he lives and the characters that Fielding is being surrounded by in Stag are, like my dad made the comment that Stag makes Rigby look like a choir boy. So it's very dark, but it was really hard to put myself a lot of times into that world again. I think like, I don't want to do it. But I'd get into it, and then it felt compelling, and at least like good writing was coming out of it, and that was hopeful, and a bit of light shining on it. But I think now, I'm also a marine diesel mechanic, and so I'll be, talking to myself down in the engine room, and maybe now I don't care as much because people go, oh, well, it's just a novelist. That's what he's a weirdo. So I think it's offered maybe a little bit more room to be a little more quirky, I guess. But I'm not taking up with any mannequins. That's for sure. For now. Anyone else?
Wow, well, Thank you. We feel like we're the pregame for Jamie Ford. So
Yeah, thanks
we
for coming.
appreciate it.
Thank you very much.